60 seconds ago, Apple quietly moved $3 billion off its Canadian balance sheet. Amazon's legal team filed an emergency briefing. Google's lobbying arm activated its highest level Washington contacts. And the average Canadian, the person paying rent, buying groceries, filling up their tank, had absolutely no idea that a single signature in Ottawa had just put their financial future in the crosshairs. This is about Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister, the man the global financial press calls the most sophisticated economic mind to ever hold that office. Former Governor of the Bank of England, former Governor of the Bank of Canada, the architect of a 3% digital services tax, retroactive all the way back to January 1st, 2022, handed to Apple, Amazon, Google, Meta, Airbnb, and Uber like a grenade with a pin already pulled. But here is what nobody in the mainstream press is telling you. Carney is not fighting Silicon Valley. He is fighting Washington. And the tech giants are not the real target. You are. Yet every headline you have seen frames this as a corporate dispute between Ottawa and big tech. That framing is deliberately incomplete because buried inside this tax war is a question so explosive that answering it too early would destroy the entire story. So I am planting it right here, and we will not answer it until the very end, because when you hear the answer, it will reframe every political and economic decision you have witnessed in the last 12 months. The question is this. If Mark Carney, the most technically brilliant economic policymaker of his generation, knew with absolute certainty that this tax would trigger a catastrophic confrontation with the United States, why did he sign it anyway? The answer is not what you think. And it changes everything. What you have been told is that this was a simple tax dispute between a government and some wealthy corporations. Two parties in a room arguing about money. That is the story they want you to carry home and forget. The truth they are hiding is that three entirely separate global forces, each one invisible on its own, converged simultaneously to produce this exact moment. And none of them have anything to do with tech companies paying their fair share. The first force began in July 2021 when 130 countries agreed to implement a global 15% minimum corporate tax rate under the OECD's Pillar 2 framework. The entire premise of that deal was that nations would stop trying to tax tech giants individually and instead act collectively. Canada signed on. Canada built its fiscal projections around it. Canada told its citizens that the era of Amazon and Google paying nothing was finally over. Then Donald Trump walked back into the White House on January 20th, 2025, and began threatening to withdraw the United States from the OECD framework entirely. According to Bloomberg Tax's analysis from February 2025, Trump's position directly threatened two specific Canadian tax rules that Ottawa had anchored to Pillar 2. The global architecture Canada depended on was being dismantled from the inside, and Carney had to make a choice. Wait for a multilateral solution that Washington was actively destroying or move unilaterally and capture the revenue before the entire framework collapsed. He chose to move, and that is where the second force comes in. In January 2026, Canada signed a quiet but seismic trade agreement with China. Under the deal, Canada lowered tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles from the original punitive rate down to 6.1% on a quota of 49,000 Chinese EVs annually. The very same tariffs Ottawa had imposed in lockstep with Washington in 2024. In exchange, Beijing reduced barriers on Canadian agricultural exports. This was not a routine trade tweak. This was a direct documented break from American foreign policy. Reuters reported on January 20th, 2026, that Carney's stated goal was to double Canada's non-US trade by 2035. Not increase it, double it. And right now, as of March 2nd, 2026, Carney is on a 9-day Indo-Pacific tour, visiting India, Australia, and Japan specifically to build an alternative trading bloc that does not run through Washington. Al Jazeera reported today that Canada and India are now targeting bilateral trade of $50 billion by 2030 and are aiming for a full trade pact before year's end. The third force is the one closest to home. Canada's economy contracted 0.6% on an annualized basis in the fourth quarter of 2025. According to Statistics Canada data released just 3 days ago, that made 2025 Canada's slowest annual growth year since the crash of 20.20. Ontario alone shed nearly 40,000 jobs between Q2 and Q3 of 2025. The national unemployment rate peaked at 7.1% in mid-year. Carney needed revenue. He needed to show Canadians that the largest corporations on earth were not going to drain Canadian wealth while ordinary families struggled to pay their mortgage. Here is your pattern interrupt. Stop for 1 second and absorb this. In France, when a nearly identical digital services tax was introduced in 2019, Google raised its advertising prices by 2%. Apple and Amazon raised consumer-facing prices by 3%. The companies did not pay the tax. The people who bought their products did. France's consumers paid France's digital services tax. And Carney's team knew this. Every finance ministry in the G7 knew this. Which means the question of who this tax was actually designed to hurt leads directly back to our master question. And we are getting closer. But first, you need to understand exactly who was sitting across the chessboard from Carney and what they actually wanted. When Trump announced on June 27, 2025, that he was, in his exact words, terminating all trade talks with Canada over the digital services tax, most commentators treated it as a fury-driven impulse, a tweet, a tantrum. That reading is catastrophically wrong. The data is clear. What was actually happening in those 48 hours between June 27th and June 29th was one of the most precisely choreographed diplomatic maneuvers in recent North American history. And Politico documented it with unusual clarity on June 30th, 2025, noting in their analysis that both Trump and Carney may have gotten exactly what they wanted from this episode. Let me explain what that means. Trump needed a win he could put on a banner. He had been taking incoming fire from American tech companies, from the Chamber of Commerce, from Republican donors in Silicon Valley, all demanding that Washington stop Canada from extracting billions from Apple and Google. The digital services tax applied retroactively to 2022 meant U.S. tech giants were looking at approximately $2 billion in back taxes. Money they had already counted, already reported, already distributed to shareholders. Trump needed to be seen protecting American companies from foreign governments. He needed the headline, Canada blinked. But here's what Carney actually wanted in return. Canada was being crushed by U.S. tariffs. The Trump administration had imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods starting March 4th, 2025. Steel faced 50% tariffs by June. The Serrano Institute in Quebec modeled the full impact. In a sustained tariff war scenario, Canada's GDP would fall 4.2% and approximately 700,000 jobs would disappear. 700,000 jobs. That is more Canadians than live in the entire city of Edmonton. Carney needed the tariff pressure to ease. He needed trade talks to reopen. And he needed to demonstrate to Canadians that he was not simply surrendering to Washington. He was negotiating from strength. So the digital services tax was a hostage. It was introduced, built up, advertised, and then released on schedule in exchange for the resumption of bilateral trade negotiations that gave Ottawa a seat at the table where the tariff conversation was actually happening. The White House called it a cave. They said Carney caved to Trump. The BBC reported the White House's exact language on June 30th, 2025. Carney quote caved. Now, here is your pattern interrupt. 7 countries in Europe, France, Italy, the United Kingdom, Spain, Austria, Turkey, and Hungary all have digital services taxes currently in force. Combined, those taxes generate approximately $5 billion annually from American tech companies. The United States has launched formal trade investigations against every single one of them. But not one European country has been forced to repeal its tax. Canada was the first country to actually back down, the first. And that asymmetry is not an accident. It is a reflection of something much deeper about Canada's structural vulnerability and what that vulnerability means for the value of every Canadian dollar sitting in your wallet right now. The real motives here were never about fairness and taxation. They were about who controls the economic architecture of North America in the decade ahead. Carney is building an exit ramp away from U.S. dependency. Trump is building a wall around American economic supremacy, and the tech giants are the most expensive chess pieces on the board. The master question is still unanswered. But the next section will make it uncomfortably personal. Let us stop talking about governments and corporations and start talking about you. Your salary, your grocery bill, your savings account, your job. Canada's GDP contracted 0.6% on an annualized basis in Q4 of 2025. The full-year growth of 1.7% was the slowest since the 2020 pandemic collapse. The OECD projected Canada's GDP growth at just 1% for 2025 and 1.1% for 2026. To understand what that means in plain language, an economy growing at 1.1% is an economy that is barely breathing. Population growth alone requires roughly 2% GDP growth just to keep per capita living standards flat. Canada is falling behind in real terms, which means the average Canadian standard of living is declining even when the headline number is technically positive. The Bank of Canada responded by cutting interest rates by a cumulative 100 basis points through late 2025. That is a full percentage point in a single year. When a central bank does that, it is not adjusting policy. It is applying a defibrillator. Lower rates mean a weaker Canadian dollar. And a weaker Canadian dollar means every imported product, every American made phone, every US software subscription, every piece of machinery that Canadian factories need to operate costs more in Canadian money. You pay more. Not Apple, not Amazon. You. Now, here's the number that should stop you cold. According to Yale University's Budget Lab, the cumulative tariffs imposed through 2025 are estimated to add between $1,000 and $2,300 to the annual cost burden of an average American household. Those are American households. Canadian households are absorbing both sides of the tariff war simultaneously. The U.S. tariffs on Canadian exports that killed jobs and reduced corporate revenues, and Canada's own counter tariffs on American imports that pushed up the price of goods on Canadian shelves. Think about a specific scenario. You walk into a Canadian electronics store in March 2026. The laptop you want is made with components that cross the Canada-US border at least twice during manufacturing. Every one of those crossings added tariff cost. The retailer passed it to the distributor. The distributor passed it to the store. The store passed it to you. Economists call this tariff stacking, and it compounds in ways that are almost impossible to trace on a price tag, but impossible to avoid at checkout. Here's your pattern interrupt. Apple's App Store generated an estimated $1.1 trillion in global gross merchandise volume in 2022 alone. A 3% Canadian digital services tax on even a fraction of that Canadian user revenue would have set a legal precedent that every government on Earth would have cited immediately. The United Kingdom, Germany, Australia, Japan, all of them were watching Ottawa in June 2025 with their own draft legislation open on the desk. Not because they cared about Canada, but because Canada's success or failure would define whether the global tech tax revolution was possible at all. When Carney backed down, 14 finance ministries around the world quietly closed their draft bills and put them back in the drawer. For Canadian workers specifically, the energy sector picture is the most alarming dimension that no one is discussing at kitchen tables. Canada supplies approximately 60% of all U.S. crude oil imports. During the peak of the trade confrontation in early 2025, Carney's government floated the idea of restricting energy flows as leverage, a threat that was quickly withdrawn but was never forgotten in Washington. The U.S. Energy Information Administration estimated that a meaningful disruption to Canadian oil supply could push American retail gasoline prices up by 20 to 40 cents per gallon within weeks. That is not a Canadian problem. That is a Houston problem, a Chicago problem, a Phoenix problem. The energy weapon cuts in both directions. And the fact that Carney was willing to pick it up, even briefly, tells you everything about how serious this confrontation actually is. The master question is still waiting. But before we answer it, you need to know what is about to happen in the next 30 days, because the timeline matters enormously. Here is your precise data-anchored forecast for the next 4 weeks. These are not guesses. These are probability weighted projections based on documented trends, current diplomatic positioning, and economic data released as recently as 3 days ago. In week one, the week of March 2nd through March 7th, the dominant event is Carney's ongoing Indo Pacific trade mission. He is currently in India, where he and Prime Minister Modi have already agreed on a $2.6 billion uranium deal and set a bilateral trade target of $50 billion by 2030. Canada is simultaneously in discussions with Australia and Japan. There is a 75% probability that before March 7th, Canada will issue a formal joint statement with at least two of these three countries announcing new trade framework agreements explicitly designed to reduce North American trade dependency. Washington will be watching and Washington will respond. In week two, March 9th through March 14th, the USMCA renegotiation timeline comes back into focus. The original USMCA review trigger is set for 2026, and both sides know that the window for locking in favorable terms is narrowing. There is a 65% probability that the Trump administration will signal new conditions for a comprehensive trade deal that specifically prohibit Canada from reimposing any form of digital services tax as part of the final agreement structure. Carney will resist any such clause publicly while privately calculating whether the concession is worth the tariff relief. In week three, March 16th through March 21st, the Bank of Canada faces mounting pressure from new GDP data showing the Q4 2025 contraction. There is a 70% probability of an additional 25 basis point rate cut. That cut will weaken the Canadian dollar further, making life modestly more expensive for Canadians buying imported goods while providing a small export advantage for Canadian manufacturers who have already survived the worst of the tariff shock. In week four, March 23rd through March 31st, the wild card arrives from Brussels, the OECD's pillar. 2. Global minimum tax framework is scheduled for a formal review. If the United States formally signals disengagement from the framework, Carney will face a binary choice. Reintroduce some version of the digital services tax, rebranded as a digital infrastructure contribution to avoid direct U.S. retaliation, or abandon the revenue base entirely and absorb the fiscal hit. There is a 60% probability of a rebranded proposal before April 1st. Here is your final pattern interrupt. The Tax Foundation reported just 7 days ago that U.S. tariffs through 2025 raised an estimated $194.8 billion in inflation-adjusted customs revenue above the 2022 to 2024 average. That is nearly $200 billion extracted primarily from importers and passed directly to consumers through higher prices. That money did not come from corporations. It came from you, from the American family that bought a Canadian-manufactured car part, from the Canadian family that bought an American appliance, from both sides of the border simultaneously. The trade war is not being fought between governments. It is being fought in the wallets of ordinary people who never voted for any of it. Now the master question, the one we planted at the very beginning. If Mark Carney, the most technically brilliant economic policymaker of his generation, knew with absolute certainty that this tax would trigger a catastrophic confrontation with the United States, why did he sign it anyway? The answer is yes, he knew. He knew completely, precisely, and in advance. And he signed it because the digital services tax was never intended to collect money from Apple and Amazon. It was a precision-engineered diplomatic instrument in a $3 billion negotiating chip that Carney designed to be surrendered on command in exchange for the one thing Canada desperately needed: the reopening of bilateral trade talks under conditions that gave Ottawa leverage to push back against 25% tariffs that were pushing Canada toward a recession the Serrano Institute projected could cost 700,000 jobs. The tax was introduced, built up, advertised, feared, and then canceled on June 29, 2025, the day before the first payment was due. Not because Carney panicked, because that was always the plan. The true cost of everything you just watched is this. While the world was distracted by a headline about tech companies and tax bills, a sitting head of government used the most powerful corporations in human history as pawns in a geopolitical chess match. And the people who paid the real price were the ones on both sides of the border who never knew the game was being played. Canadian workers absorbed job losses and a contracting economy. American consumers absorbed $1,000 to $2,300 in added annual household costs from the broader tariff war. And 14 governments around the world watching from the sidelines quietly learned that the global tech tax revolution can still be stopped if Washington applies enough pressure. You now understand the playbook. Here is what you do with it. Earlier in this video, we talked about Carney's deal with China, the January 2026 agreement that lowered tariffs on 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles, directly breaking from U.S. policy, while Canada simultaneously courts India, Japan, and Australia to build an alternative trading bloc. That deal is not a footnote. It is the next crisis because Washington has not yet formally responded to Canada's China EV agreement. And when it does, the confrontation that follows will make the digital services tax episode look like a warm-up act. The next video you must watch is the one about Canada's China EV deal and what Washington's inevitable retaliation means for North American trade, your energy costs, and the survival of the USMCA itself. Because what happens there will make everything you just learned in this video make complete devastating sense. Watch it now. The clock is all ready.